and welcome. You're on Learn Extra Live, and we're doing life sciences today. This is Eugen standing next to me, and I'm Katlaho. As you know, Eugen, please let us know what we'll be doing today.
Well, today we're looking at ecology, and we're going to focus exclusively on the biosphere and some of the nutrient cycles. And yeah, I'm looking forward to interacting with the learners.
Okay, awesome. So you guys know that you can ask him any questions or any comments or even just a shout out to say welcome to the Learn Extra Mindset family. And yeah, we're very happy to have you here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Sure, you can walk over to your board.
Thanks,
Guys, so you know how to get hold of us. Our Facebook page is facebook.com/Learn Extra, and we're on Twitter at Learn Extra. So make sure today you make it awesome. I know life science is a favorite. You guys are a bit biased, but it is a favorite. So I know there'll be lots of interaction and lots of questions and comments and anything that you'd like to tell me. Please tell me. As you know that it's Wednesday and it's midweek, so there's a lots that's been going on at school that you can actually tell us about. Over to you again.
Thanks, Katleko. Welcome, guys. I know life sciences is probably one of the most interesting subjects that you all do. Today we're going to look at the environment, and we're going to focus specifically on the biosphere. Before I start, we must chat about what ecology is. Basically, ecology is the study of the interactions between the living and the non-living components in the environment. Specifically today we're looking at the biosphere. Okay, so let's go to the board. Right, so environmental studies. Okay, the concept of the biosphere. What does biosphere mean? Biosphere is made up of two words. Bio, meaning living, and sphere, something that is spherical in shape. Okay, so it obviously refers to the living organisms that occupy Earth. Okay. Right, so this is the part of the Earth where humans and other organisms are able to live. Okay, the Earth is the surface. The Earth is spherical in shape, and it supports life, and hence we call this the biosphere. The biosphere extends between 7,000 to 8,000 meters above the sea level and about 6,000 to 8,000 meters below sea level. If I were to draw a diagram to represent this, okay, this is what we're going to see. Okay, so we're seeing that here we've got land and we've got the ocean. Okay, these are your water bodies. Okay, so we say that the Earth, that the biosphere extends between 6,000 to 8,000 meters below the sea level and between 7,000 to 8,000 meters above. Okay, and these collectively form the biosphere. Okay, when we look at the concept of the biosphere, we need to look at the interactions of different components. Okay, life essentially exists on Earth because of energy available to organisms. Energy is available to organisms in the air, in the water, and in the soil, and hence both the air, the water, and the soil all supports life on Earth. Let's have a look at these in further detail. Okay. Life exists where energy from the sun can interact with the lithosphere, the atmosphere, and the hydrosphere. When we look at the sun provides radiant energy. And that energy is available to all organisms. Energy is responsible. This energy is required by them for different physiological processes. Let's look at the Earth, the lithosphere. Okay, when we look at the lithosphere, this refers to the surface rocks and the soil on the surface of the Earth. If you look at the air forms the atmosphere, and that is the air that we all need essentially for oxygen, and plants carbon dioxide for photosynthesis. We also have life in the water, and we refer to that as the hydrosphere. Hydro refers to water, and sphere, the Earth. Okay. Right, so the three main parts of the biosphere are the atmosphere, which is the air, the hydrosphere, which refers to all the water that exists on Earth, and the lithosphere, the rocks and the soil. Let's look at the atmosphere in detail. Okay. the atmosphere is made up of gases, various gases, and these gases need to be stable in the environment. So we know that the air is not only exclusively oxygen, but is made up of nitrogen, carbon dioxide, water vapor, and some of the other gases. Let's look at the composition of the air in the atmosphere. Okay, so the atmosphere has gases. It has oxygen, which is 21%, carbon dioxide, which is 0.03% of the atmosphere, nitrogen, which is a whopping 71% of the environment of the atmosphere, and the remaining gases being water vapor and hydrogen. Water vapor is essentially H2O, and hydrogen, a very important element in most of the organic compounds. Okay. It is important, the atmosphere is very important for two major physiological processes, respiration and photosynthesis. It also plays a very important role in filtering out the harmful ultraviolet rays from the sun. And we know that in recent times, the effect of the ozone depletion has had increased global warming, and hence the atmosphere has played a very important role in controlling the amount of harmful rays that penetrates the Earth's surface. Okay. Right, the next component is the hydrosphere. When we look at the hydrosphere again, hydro refers to water. We'll see that the hydrosphere is made up of all the water bodies on the Earth, and these can be divided into two types of water bodies. The first one consists of the oceans, and the second, the rivers and the lakes. When we look at the ocean, this supports the aquatic organisms that survive in a marine environment, meaning that they live in water that is salty, whereas we've got freshwater organisms that survive in water that is found in rivers and in lakes and your dams, etc. Okay. The freshwater makes up only 3% of the hydrosphere, whereas the remaining 97% is made up by the oceans. Okay. And what is interesting about this point is that we humans rely on this 3% for our existence. Okay. Let's move on. It is the habitat for many aquatic organisms, as well as microorganisms such as plankton, fish, your larger organisms such as sharks, and your whales. And these all depend on water, and hence this water supports their life. And it's important that the quality of water needs to be maintained. We will discuss the impact of that humans have had on the hydrosphere. Okay. The third component is the lithosphere, and then that refers to the crust of the Earth. Okay. When we look at the lithosphere, it refers to all the rocks and the soil. In specific, a thin layer of soil on the surface of the Earth, and that is what we refer to that as the topsoil. And this is essentially what supports life, and especially the plant life. We also have microorganisms living in the soil, and we'll discuss that in a while. It is a source of ions and minerals which all living organisms need. Towards the start of grade 10, your teachers would have discussed with you the inorganic compounds as well as organic compounds. Some of the minerals and minerals and ions that we rely on include sulfur, phosphorus, potassium, sodium, chloride, calcium. These all come from the soil. The soil is also a habitat for microscopic invertebrates as well as your larger vertebrates. So what are the invertebrates that live in soil? Some of the invertebrates include firstly refer to organisms that do not have a skull or a vertebral column, and these would include your earthworms that you find in your garden, so your earthworms. Even the bacteria that survive in the soil. It is said that if you take a fistful of soil, and if you were to count the number of bacteria in that fistful of soil, there'll be probably more bacteria in that than the amount of humans living on Earth. So that's the number of bacteria that we have in a palm full of soil. Your larger vertebrates could be your rodents, the rats, Many of the other organisms that live in dwellings or in burrows in the ground all depend on the soil for their existence. Okay. Before we move on, let's recap. So the biosphere, three components: the lithosphere, the hydrosphere, and the atmosphere. Okay. So when scientists and ecologists study the biosphere, it is broken up into three different components. Okay, we look at them in smaller areas. Into smaller areas called. These include the following. Okay, the biosphere, and this biosphere refers to and I often refer to this as the umbrella under which all the other little areas fall under. So that will be the biosphere. Below the biosphere, we have many biomes that make up the biosphere. We have several ecosystems that make up a biome, a single biome, and we have several communities within an ecosystem. And within a community, we have several populations that form communities, and we have organisms that make up a population. We're going to look at each one of these in detail. Now, sorry. Okay. So this slide shows you the biosphere, which is made up of many biomes. Biomes are made up of many ecosystems, and an ecosystem supports many communities. You'll find several populations within a community, and a population is made up of organisms. Okay. Right. Here's an example of a biosphere. Okay. Here we have a single organism, the springbok, which we're all familiar with. Okay. These springbok make up a population. So population refers to several individuals belong to the same species inhabiting a specific area. Okay. Several different populations of birds, the meerkats, and springbok collectively in an area form a community. Several communities form an ecosystem. And an ecosystem with other ecosystems put together form the biome. Okay, let's look at these in greater detail in the next slide. Okay. Are you guys following? Okay. Right. Please let me get some live feed as to whether I'm going too fast or slow. I'm looking forward to hearing from you guys. Okay. Let's look at the biosphere. The biosphere is that part of the earth where humans and other organisms are able to live. Okay. We said that a biome is a group of ecosystems that have a similar climate with a similar dominant community. So made up of several communities that form that biome. An ecosystem is then a collection of organisms that live together in a particular place, as well as their non-living or their physical environment. So it's the interaction between the organisms and their environment. Communities are a collection of different populations that live together in a defined area, and that is very important. A community has a defined area in which the organisms interact. Okay. A population, and this term often comes up as definitions. A population refers to a group of individuals that belong to the same species that live in the same area. So essentially, if we look at the Kruger National Park, and if we talk of the elephant population, we refer to a group of individuals that belong to the same species, obviously elephants, that inhabit the same area. A defined area would be the Kruger National Park. That would be an example of a population. So when we refer to a population, we refer to a group of organisms in a specific area belonging to the same species. The organisms that form a population are the single units of life that inhabit that area. So living organisms inhabit different areas. We refer to them as organisms, and they form populations when they group together. Species refers to a group of organisms that have similar characteristics to one another. They can interbreed and most importantly, produce offspring that are fertile. Let me repeat that again. Okay, so when we refer to the term species, we refer to a group of organisms that can interbreed and produce offspring that are fertile. And they all have similar characteristics. Okay. Let's look at the interconnections in the biosphere. Okay. So life on Earth is supported by a thin zone, and we refer to that as the biosphere, and that is made up of soil, air, water. Living organisms are found mostly in the upper layers of the hydrosphere and on the lower layers of the atmosphere. Life on Earth is linked to each of these three spheres. The two main components of the biosphere are the biotic components and the abiotic components. Let's look at these in detail. Biotic refers to the living components, whereas the abiotic referred to the non-living components. Okay. Examples of the not living components would be the organisms that you find in a population. I mean, and these could be plants, animals, both microscopic, macroscopic, and we can go and look at the abiotic components, and these are the non-living, which would include the soil, the pH of the soil, temperature of the environment, and these are all factors that influence the type of organisms that inhabit a specific area. Okay. When we study the biosphere, it's important to understand the interactions between organisms and the environment. And these interactions are seen through various cycles. So during the next few slides, we're going to look at the nutrient cycle, and we're going to see how energy and nutrients are available to organisms and how that cycle is maintained in the biosphere. Okay. So the nutrient cycle. Living organisms need energy. Energy is needed. Energy is needed for physiological processes, for respiration. And that is where the nutrient cycle is very important. To stay healthy, living organisms need those nutrients. Okay. So the following cycle we're going to look at is the nutrient cycle. Okay. So what are the producers of nutrients in the environment? When we look at the producers, we refer to the organisms that produce energy. So the producers would be your plants. And these plants would produce energy through a process known as photosynthesis. Yes, you probably have done this already in school, photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is a key process where organisms utilize energy. They use the radiant energy from the sun, then they convert that into chemical energy. This energy is then trapped in plants, as well as in aquatic organisms that can photosynthesize, and that energy is then available to your consumers. So your consumers refer to organisms that will utilize the energy produced by your producers, and these include, so the consumers would include your primary consumers, and these would be the herbivores. Then you get your secondary consumers, and your tertiary consumers. Okay, so you have your producers, your plants that photosynthesize, and they produce the chemical energy that is then utilized by your primary consumers. Your primary consumers will then be your herbivores. These are your plant consuming organisms, so it'll be your sheep, your cattle. Your secondary consumers would be your predators, and your tertiary would be organisms that consume both omnivores and carnivores. And these indirectly get the energy from the plants through a process of which photosynthesize their food.
Can we go for a quick break?
I'm sure, Katleko, we need that now, and I'm sure our learners will catch up with some of their notes.
Yes, of course. And you guys, of course, know that you can ask questions during the break. So shoot your questions off to Eugen and he'll be happy to answer them. See you right after this. Welcome back, Mindsetters. As you know, we are doing life sciences and we're doing environmental studies today, and we're focusing on the biosphere. So I hope that you guys have joined us. As I see on Facebook, you really, really have, and you're really involved, and I'm enjoying the interaction because shows me that you're actually enjoying it. So good. And if you want, you can call your other grade 10 friends and learners from school and tell them to join us, because we are aware that this is a very important section in your grade 10 syllabus. So make sure that you keep focusing. Over to you again.
Thanks, Katleko. Yes, we cannot stress how important this section is, and you'll find that it's relevant, it's current, and we deal with issues like this in our everyday life. So we had a few questions posted on Facebook. We're going to deal with, I'm trying to answer a few of those, and we had a caller who called in and wanted to know the role of decomposers in the nutrient cycle. And yes, they actually beat me to that question. Let me get back to the nutrient cycle. When we look at the consumers, these are the organisms that will utilize the food produced by the producers. Eventually, all consumers will die, and their nutrients would need to return back into the soil. And so we refer to that process of them being returned back into the soil as decomposition. So what would play an important role in decomposition? Bacteria, exactly. So the bacteria play a very important role in the process of decomposition. They will break down through different physiological chemical processes. They will break down the organic nutrients in these consumers. So it would be your plants will decompose, your consumers, your primary, secondary, and tertiary consumers would decompose with bacteria. And these nutrients then return back into the environment. A very important decomposer would be the earthworms in your garden, and they help to keep the nutrients. So they will feed on all the dried leaves, and they will return the nutrients back into the soil. In the wild, you've got animals that die, and they are eaten by the other larger scavengers, and the carcasses that are left over will decompose by bacteria, and those nutrients then return back into the soil. Okay. If we go on, so the nutrient cycle is needed for living organisms to do the following, so that energy can flow through the ecosystem. Nutrients move from the environment to the living organisms and back again into the environment. So this is why we refer to this as a cycle. This means that there's a fixed amount of nutrients in the biosphere, which is cycled over and over again. And hence, we say that the bacteria and the decomposers play a very important role in returning the nutrients back into the soil to be available to producers all over again. Okay. The next cycle we're looking at is the carbon cycle. When we look at carbon is a very important element. At the start of grade 10, your teachers would have discussed with you organic compounds. When we look at carbon plays an important role, is an important element in organic compounds. An example of an organic compound is glucose, C6H12O6. There you find carbon, which is an important element in that compound. Okay, so carbon, which is very important to plants and animals, is found in your carbohydrates, your fats, and your proteins. So it's essentially a building block, a building element in your important organic compounds. Photosynthesis and respiration are the two main processes that drive the carbon cycle. So these processes are responsible for driving the carbon cycle, producing carbon, and utilizing carbon so that the levels of carbon in the atmosphere remain stable. Okay. When we look at the cycle, the carbon cycle, we see two main processes here: respiration and photosynthesis. And yes, respiration and photosynthesis happens both on the land as well as in the water body. So it's both on the lithosphere as well as in the hydrosphere. Let's look at photosynthesis in the water bodies. So photosynthesis will take place by plants that are capable of trapping radiant energy from the sun and producing glucose. For photosynthesis to take place, plants require carbon dioxide, and these would utilize carbon dioxide and produce oxygen. Respiration would produce carbon dioxide. As a result of respiration taking place in the mitochondria, utilizes oxygen and produces carbon dioxide, which then returns back into the atmosphere. The same applies for these two processes on land. Respiration by animals and photosynthesis by plants. Plants produce oxygen, they utilize the carbon dioxide present in the air and produce oxygen. Respiration by your cattle and your animals on land produce large amounts of carbon dioxide, which then contribute to the pool of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Okay. So carbon dioxide is available in the air and in water. During photosynthesis, plants utilize carbon dioxide to make carbohydrates, which is the simple sugars. Okay. The carbohydrates are then passed along the food webs from the producers to the consumers. We saw that in the previous slide during the nutrient cycle. Okay. It is then returned back into the environment through the following ways. During respiration, where carbon dioxide is released back into the environment, by decomposition through bacteria and other decomposers that produce carbon dioxide. These organisms feed on dead plant and animals, and they give off carbon dioxide, which then gets back into the atmosphere to maintain the amount of carbon dioxide in the environment. Humans are also important major contributors of carbon in the environment. Apart from respiration, we also burn fossil fuels, we cut down trees, and we burn forests. And these release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And what is unique about human intervention is that it is much more than in the past. So humans have contributed to large amounts of carbon production in the atmosphere, and this is unsettled. This is left to an unstable carbon cycle. We're going to do that at the end of the slide. The delicate balance is maintained between the removal of carbon dioxide from the air and water by photosynthesis and its return and the return of carbon dioxide to the environment by respiration. The amount of carbon dioxide in the air should remain the same. However, this is not the case. We will discuss the influence that humans have had on the carbon cycle. But the level of carbon dioxide is increasing because of human activity. We will discuss that impact soon. The consequences of this is the greenhouse effect as well as global warming, which has obviously led to escalated temperatures on the earth, destruction of the ozone layer, and drought. Okay. The next cycle we're going to look at is the nitrogen cycle. Living things need nitrogen to make proteins. Nitrogen is a gas that makes up 78% of the atmosphere. Nitrogen is not utilized by the organisms or by humans. They need to be first changed to nitrates before they are used. And for this process, plants play a very important role. So it's the plants that convert atmospheric nitrogen into nitrates, which are then utilized by other living organisms. Let's look at the cycle in detail. So the atmosphere contains 77% nitrogen. This is then fixed by bacteria in the roots of leguminous plants. So we've got certain plants that have nitrogen, which have nodules, and in them we've got bacteria. And these bacteria are responsible for trapping atmospheric nitrogen and converting them into nitrates. These plants are then utilized by organisms, and they convert the nitrates into proteins. So they play a very important role as a source of protein, as an element for protein development which animals rely on. These proteins then will return back. Once the animal decomposes, these proteins will be broken up, and during the process of decomposition, bacteria then break down the proteins and return the nitrates back into the soil. During excretion, large amounts of waste are produced. We have denitrifying bacteria that will convert some of the nitrates back into nitrogen, and that is how the nitrogen pool is maintained in the atmosphere. In the ocean bodies, we've got nitrogen fixing blue-green algae, which also fix the nitrogen in the atmosphere, and this is then available to the aquatic organisms. Again, when they decompose, these nitrates are then returned back into the soil. The denitrifying bacteria will then break them down and convert them back into nitrogen. Okay. So animals get their nitrogen from plants that they eat. Bacteria break down the dead plants and animals, converting the proteins into ammonium ions. Ammonium is changed into nitrates by certain bacteria. This process is called nitrification. Okay, I'll repeat this again. Ammonium is changed into nitrates by denitrifying bacteria. This process is called nitrification. Okay. We then have nitrogen-fixing bacteria, which are able to take the nitrogen gas from the air and convert them into bacterial proteins, and this is how the nitrogen cycle will maintain the level of nitrogen in the atmosphere. The next cycle we look at is the oxygen cycle. Okay. The oxygen cycle is the movement of oxygen among the atmosphere, biosphere, and the lithosphere. The main reservoir of the Earth's oxygen is the Earth's crust, and it contains 99.5% of the Earth's oxygen available. Here's the cycle of the oxygen cycle, here's the diagram of the oxygen cycle, which we look at in detail. So the two main processes that are responsible for maintaining the amount of oxygen in the environment is photosynthesis and photolysis. Let's look at these two processes in detail. So in the biosphere, the driving factor of the oxygen cycle is photosynthesis. During photosynthesis, plants use carbon dioxide and water, and they produce sugars, which is glucose, and oxygen. In addition to photosynthesis, photolysis also contributes to the amount of oxygen in the environment, in the atmosphere. So what is photolysis? During this process, high energy UV radiation breaks down the atmospheric water and nitrates into hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen. And that is how the oxygen levels are maintained in the oxygen cycle. So if we look at this cycle again, so we see photosynthesis, the plants being the major contributors of the oxygen levels in the atmosphere, along with photolysis, which is the effect of sunlight on the atmosphere, and that contributes to the amount of oxygen. Respiration and decay also, there's certain anaerobic bacteria that produce oxygen during the process of decomposition. Okay, go on to the next slide. Okay, before we go on to the next slide, we're going to take some questions. Okay, I've put up a few questions, but Katleko during the break obviously chatted to me, and there were some questions that were raised by you guys. Katleko, could we have those questions?
Yes, you can. One question is by Nsako. He asks, what is the difference between biosphere and biodiversity?
Interesting question, Nsako. Okay, I'm going to elaborate on those two concepts just below this here. Okay, so biosphere and biodiversity. Okay, so we've dealt with biosphere today. Biosphere refers to the three components that make up the environment. So it's the air, water, and the soil and rocks. Biodiversity, on the other hand, refers to the variety. If we break down the word biodiversity, it refers to the variety. So diversity refers to the variety, and bio refers to living organisms. So if I were to answer this question correctly, biodiversity refers to the variety of living organisms inhabiting an area, and we know that South Africa is a country with rich biodiversity because we've got a variety of living organisms in it. Biosphere refers to the three components which we've discussed already. So that's the air, the water, the rocks and the soil, and the interaction with the living components. Okay, hope that answers your question, Sako.
Okay, next question. This one just came in by Priska. No, sorry, that's not the Priska one. Kelly. Kelly asks, what is a decomposer?
Interesting question. Decomposers are organisms that will be responsible for breaking down the dead organisms, the dried leaves, and returning them back into the environment. So decomposers could be microscopic organisms, or even some of your smaller invertebrates which utilize or which feed on organic matter or dried dead leaves, etc. So they are responsible for breaking down and returning nutrients back into the soil.
Okay. So let's just ask Priska's one before we go to a break. She asks, what happens to the biosphere due to global warming? And despite temperatures, how does this damage the well-being of the human?
Interesting question. When we get back after the break, we're going to deal with this in detail. But yes, and that is the concept of understanding the environment today. Once we understand the environment and the cycles, we will then be able to understand the impact that humans have had on this. Essentially, through increased carbon emissions, we've offset the balance of carbon dioxide in the environment. Global warming, greenhouse effect are all consequences of an increased human activity in the environment. The simple example that I can give you is if we cut down all the trees, there's not going to be enough of oxygen produced by the trees for human activity. The amount of carbon dioxide would increase because obviously trees are not going to be able to utilize the carbon, and hence we will have a shift in the balance between the carbon dioxide levels and the oxygen levels.
Okay, so can we take a quick break? Remember that during the break, you can ask questions. So you can keep sending in your questions. And the ones that we have now, I am going to show you again so that he can answer it in our last segment. See you after the break. Welcome back, Mindsetters. Wow, you guys are actually really on the ball today. What's more fantastic is that you guys are helping each other. It is absolutely awesome. And if you guys need extra help, remember that the page is always free and empty, so you can keep asking questions, and you learners can keep helping each other even through the night and in the morning when we are not here. And you can even make it a step further and actually get each other's contact numbers and sit and chat about these things, have study groups and all that. I mean, that's what we're here for, right? Over to you again.
Thanks, Katleko. Some interesting questions that you guys have posted. We're gonna tackle those questions once we go through some of the questions that I've got up. And if you think that I'm going a bit too fast, Katleko's been good enough. She's been kind enough to put up those notes for you guys, so you guys can refer to those notes. But we will try and answer these questions and then get to your questions at the end of these questions. So I want you guys to interact with me, and if you can post some of your answers, let's see. Okay. So the first question. So study the diagram and answer the questions below. Here we've got a diagram showing a springbuck and different components. Whenever you see a diagram, the first thing you should do is try and identify and label the diagram before we attempt to answer the questions. Okay, so obviously label number 1 would point to the atmosphere. Label number 2 points to the hydrosphere, and label number 3 points to the lithosphere. Okay, so let's look at the first question. Give the correct scientific term for the following: the soil and rocks forming the upper surface of the earth. We've done that already, and the answer to that question would be the lithosphere. Give the correct scientific term for the portion of the earth in which living organisms are found. And that's what we've been doing since the start of this lesson. And that would be the biosphere. Okay, we're going to go back. I'm going to take that question. Okay. I've messed up on this question here. Name the parts. Okay, before we... Okay. Right, so name the parts labeled number 1, 2, and 3. Number 1 points to the atmosphere. Number 2 to the hydrosphere. And number 3 points to the lithosphere. Okay. We've answered those questions. Okay. The next question. And this is a question that relates to the impact of humans have had on the environment. Okay. So the question is, how can the release of sulfur dioxide in part 1, which is the atmosphere, affect parts 2 and 3? Okay. I'm going to extend the page. So the question basically wants us to establish what will the effect of sulfur dioxide in part 1, which is the atmosphere, affect parts 2 and 3. So let's look at what sulfur dioxide is. So sulfur dioxide is a gas. Where's sulfur dioxide emitted from? So it's emitted from your factories, it's emitted from car exhaust, and this is a pollutant. So it's a pollutant that pollutes the atmosphere. Sulfur dioxide will combine with water. So we have water plus sulfur dioxide, which forms H2SO4. Well, guys, you don't have to be a brilliant science student to know this, even if you don't. Okay, we need to understand that water plus sulfur dioxide forms H2SO4, which is sulfuric acid. Yes, an acid. So what would the impact of an acid be? So acids obviously would have a pH of 1 to 6.9. An acid could be strong or it could be weak. So what happens with sulfur dioxide as it gets into the atmosphere? Okay, so the sulfur dioxide plus the water in the atmosphere form sulfuric acid, and that then enters into the water bodies, polluting the water bodies, and enters into the ground, polluting the ground. What would happen to the pH of the water? The water will become slightly acidic. What would happen to the pH of the soil? The pH of the soil would change. That will also become acidic, meaning that the plants that rely on the soil for their nutrition, for the water, would be affected by the change in pH. So how can the release of sulfur dioxide in parts number 1 affect 2 and 3? We would see that it would affect plant growth, it would affect the aquatic organisms that are living in these water bodies, and hence these organisms will not function, they will not survive effectively. Okay. The next question. Study the diagram and answer the questions below. Give the correct sign. We've done that. Let's move on to the next question, guys. We've done that as well. Let's look at the the next question. Think of a rural village or farm and explain how the carbon cycle works there. Now, essentially, we've got to look at the activities that happen in a farm or in a rural area, and what are the producers of carbon dioxide. So, in a farm, you would find that cattle would produce large amounts of carbon dioxide. Removing of trees, deforestation, these contribute significantly to the reduction of the trees, and these will not then compensate for the changes in the carbon dioxide level. So this is a 5-mark question. Let's see how you would answer this question. So think of the rural village and explain how the carbon cycle works there. So if we go back to our carbon cycle, we see that the main contributors of the carbon would be the animals and humans. So the cattle will produce carbon dioxide. The farm machinery, so the farm machines that rely on petrol, these produce carbon dioxide. If a farmer was removing trees to create more space for agricultural land, deforestation. This will contribute to increased levels of carbon dioxide. And hence, you'll find that carbon dioxide levels will definitely be affected by human activity. If we go on to the next question, think of the center of a developed city like Johannesburg or even Cape Town and explain how the carbon cycle works there. This would be very different because of industrialization, because of mechanization, transportation. We have large factors that contribute to increase carbon dioxide levels, and hence we would need to answer this question looking at what contributes significantly to increase carbon dioxide emissions in these areas. Okay, so in a town, in a city, what would be the contributors of carbon dioxide? Firstly, so it would be transportation. So transport systems. You know that because these are cosmopolitan cities, you have large amounts of carbon dioxide being produced by motor vehicles. We also have several industries, and these industries contribute to carbon dioxide levels as well. Okay. And obviously the last question, and I'd like to pose this question to you so that you could think about what you can do to reduce your carbon impact. How can people living in both these areas reduce the amount of carbon dioxide going into the air? And essentially this is the impact that you and I have on the environment. And the simple things that we could do would be planting trees, reducing the amount of fossil fuels that are burnt, indirectly or directly. I know there were a few more questions that we've had. We're going to take a few questions and try and answer them in the last few minutes of this program.
Okay. Deborah has a question. Are the secondary consumers herbivores or carnivores?
If we look at secondary consumers would essentially be organisms that feed off the primary consumers. For example, a primary consumer would be a sheep. A secondary consumer would be an organism that would feed off a sheep. Often, secondary consumers are not omnivores. An omnivore is an organism that feeds both on plant as well as on other herbivores, and hence an organism like a monkey, a chimpanzee could be classified as an omnivore as opposed to a secondary consumer like a leopard, which exclusively feeds on a herbivore.
Okay. And then there's one that I think is just for clarity. What portion of the earth in which living organisms are found? Which portion of the earth? I think you meant.
Which portion of the earth are living organisms found? Well, the earth will essentially support living organisms in the lithosphere, the hydrosphere, and the atmosphere, with the bulk of the organisms being found in the aquatic, because obviously that takes up the largest portion of the surface of the earth.
Okay, thank you. Thank you again. Thank you, Mindsetters. You guys were absolutely awesome today. And these questions really do show us that you guys are absolutely focused with us. Thank you for an awesome show. Remember, Life Sciences will be again next week, Wednesday, same time, same place. Bye, guys.